Order. Welcome to today's session, which is the first of our inquiry on children's social care, and we're going to be taking oral evidence from two panels this morning. I will introduce the first one, who are in front of us. We have Katharine Sachs-Jones, Chief Executive of Become, William McMahon, Project Worker at the Care Leavers Association, and Lynn Perry, MBE, Chief Executive of Barnardo. So you're all very welcome. And can I just ask perhaps each of the panel first, do you support the aims of the government's children's social care strategy, Stable Homes Built on Love, and do you believe that they are deliverable? Katharine, let's start, yeah.
Sure. I mean, the aims are kind of hard to disagree with, really. You know, we all want stability for children in the care system, and I think all children need love in order to thrive, and sadly that's often lacking in the lives of many children in care. But I think what we see in the strategy itself is I'm afraid, actions that are rather piecemeal, a lot which are delayed. There's a lot where the further consultation is needed or legislation is needed, and there's no parliamentary time as yet allocated for any of that. And I think when we look at the levels of investment that the government is putting in, 200 million compared to the 2.6 billion called for by the review, and the 4 billion the Local Government Association are saying is a funding gap they face in this area in the next few years, then I think there are serious questions about whether, you know, the kind of progress and those ambitions that are set out will be realised.
Thank you for that introduction. And just can I just pick up on the legislation? What legislation do you see as being required in terms of what needs to be got on with?
Yeah, so there's a whole range of policy proposals for which the government has said we will legislate when time allows. So to give you an example, for care leavers, entitlement to extending the entitlement to staying close and staying put, which are schemes which enable young people to stay with their foster family or to stay connected to the children's home they were in. The government has said in that area we will look at legislating to extend the age at which young people can stay in those settings, and we haven't yet seen a timetable for that. Another example is extending corporate parenting responsibilities, so that's the duty that at the moment local authorities have for children in care. The government has talked about extending those duties to other bodies, for example the Health Service, DWP and others. Very welcome, but again that requires legislation and there's no timetable for that. And they're just two examples. There's a whole host of other policy measures that require legislation.
I mean, Katharine, on corporate parenting, I used to be deputy leader of a council and chair of the education committee, and I kind of always thought of the idea of being a corporate parent is much wider than just the local authority. Any public body in the area which had any responsibility for children, from my perspective.
Well, at the moment, the duties apply to local authorities rather than other bodies, but the proposal is to widen that out. And at Become, we provide the Secretariat for the APPG on children in care, and they've just done an inquiry which we supported, looking at how young people would like corporate parenting to be expanded and the kind of range of ways in which other bodies could do that. And we did that in advance, expecting a government consultation on corporate parenting, and we're still not sure when that's coming, and it would then require legislation following that.
I mean, I'm thinking particularly since, I've been in this place since 2010, but since 2010 there's been a massive rise, for instance, in the growth of multi-academy trust schools. The multi-academy trust schools take on many of the responsibilities that local authorities used to have to go towards children and their education. Would we not regard them within the corporate parenting envelope?
I think it would be great to see that. It would be great to see legislation extend to exactly those kind of bodies, because we know, for example, that children in care are more likely to be excluded from the school system. So it's exactly in those areas where it could make a real difference. So that's one area that we'd absolutely like to see taken.
Getting on and consulting so that they can come forward with the legislation would be welcome. Thank you for that. Lynn, can I bring you in on that first question just around the aims of the strategy and how deliverable it is?
Yeah, thank you. It's certainly a step in the right direction, and we welcome some of the proposals and some of the specific progress that's been made already in terms of things like the Family First Pathfinder programme being launched, work to reform the guidance on advocacy and the revised guidance on multi-agency working. Also, some smaller step change on funding, offering some quite welcome initiatives, things like setting up home grant, for care leavers being increased, and an increased level of financing for the extended rollout of staying close, and importantly, I think the launch of the kinship care strategy. So there are certainly some areas where there is progress, but we think the pace of the progress is too slow. And as Katharine has already outlined, there is a lack of investment to make this happen and to realise the ambitions, and also the legislative changes that Katharine was talking about we haven't seen. We also need some stability. We've had 5 changes in the Children's Minister in the last 2 years, and of course we are facing into a general election year. So what we would like to see is cross-party reform. There's a real concern, I think, that momentum might be lost despite some of the progress that's been made, and the gap in funding from the 2.6 billion and the 200 million is obviously very significant. Some of the areas that we'd like to see legislated for include placing new family help teams on a statutory level, new rights for care leavers, including a statutory entitlement to staying put, and changing homeless legislation to make sure that care leavers are given a priority. There's also an opportunity for a new opt-out right to an advocate for all children in care that could be included in legislative reform.
Okay, thank you. And I think it's very helpful for this committee when we're holding ministers to account to be able to chase up on some of those legislative points. So I think that is, I'm grateful for those pointers. Will, thank you for waiting patiently.
It's okay. I'd like to kind of agree with what we've heard previously. I think that gets it right. We asked our membership what they thought of what they'd seen so far of the review. They don't think it goes far enough. They don't think there's enough focus on care leavers. They don't think there was enough focus on residential care. And the majority didn't think the kind of mission outlined would produce significant change, I'm afraid, because there is a feeling that things happen far too slowly, or they just don't happen. Many people point to the Conservative Party manifesto, which promised to review the care system to make sure that all care placements and settings are providing children and young adults with the support they need. And in the view of the CLA, this has got a very low priority in this review. There could have, in fact, we think, been a number of separate reviews, one on early intervention, which we think is really important, and there's a lot of work gone on in early intervention for a very long time. It's important to do. 2, child protection. 3, the care system, and 4, the workforce. And we just think that the original impetus for the lives of care leavers going through the system, leaving care, it's not reflected in the review.
Okay, so what, from where we are now, what changes would you be pushing for to take that further?
Much of what's been mentioned before, actually. I wouldn't want to repeat that, but I think one of the issues that I think is problematic is that there's lots of good stuff written down, but ensuring it's delivered on the ground is a big problem, and we have to think about that, because you can have local offers. I mean, I don't want it, well, I'm going to say postcode lottery, because that's what it is. There needs, we kind of agree with what Barnardo's are putting forward in terms of saying there needs to be baselines in terms of bus fares and leaving care and all that kind of stuff. But also, we kind of welcome some more space there to have innovation as well. Actually, from local work, you can get innovations that you really haven't thought of. Yeah, so a firm baseline of what's provided, but some innovation as well. Because otherwise, understandably, authorities and practitioners step back to what's
the statutory?
What's the statutory? Yeah. And actually, that can be a mistake because you don't learn.
Yeah. And clearly, across all 3 of you, there's a concern about resourcing here, fundamentally, and that the organisations which are charged with these responsibilities need the resources in order to carry them out effectively. Yeah. I'll go over to Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you so much. We understand that children's social services are struggling. There's a huge demand for children to get into children's services care. But can you please tell us what are the reasons why this demand is increasing every day, and what the local authorities can do to tackle this, and how much pressure they are under when it comes to the funding. What's the take?
I think if you look over a long time period, we've seen a kind of consistent rise for the last at least 10 years in the numbers of children in care. One of the drivers of that is poverty, and there's quite clear evidence that there are links between a rise in poverty in the population and a rise in children in care, because we know poverty puts pressure on families, is linked to rises in abuse and neglect, and is linked to children entering the care system. I think at the same time you've seen reductions in early support services, so whether that's youth services or early family help, again over the last kind of decade or so we've seen a reduction to many of those services, so more families are reaching a crisis point where children are coming into the care system, and at the same time they're not then getting the support that children might come out of the care system and go back to their family home, because that's less likely without the support there. So I think they are contributory factors. There's been a kind of change in the care population, so there are more older teenagers coming into the care system for a range of reasons, some of which are to do with risks outside the family home, so gang-related violence, child sexual exploitation, county lines, things like that. So they are a factor as well. And I think particularly in recent years, we've seen a rise in unaccompanied asylum-seeking children entering the care system as well. So there's about 7,000 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children now in the care system, and that's double what it was a few years ago. So there's been an increase, and they are a significant proportion. But if you look at overall numbers of 84,000, they're still a small number, but that is a factor. And particularly over the last couple of years, there's actually been a drop in unaccompanied asylum-seeking children coming into the care system, and the rise is due to unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. That's only in the last couple of years, and I think it's COVID related. So what you've seen is during COVID, the numbers of children in need have gone down because children are not coming to were not coming to the attention of authorities, in the same way that they were previously. Children at risk were not being picked up on. So I think that is what we're seeing in the numbers.
Those numbers, you feel?
Exactly. And I think what you're likely to see as you look forward is the numbers of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children go up once that kind of COVID effect works its way through.
Lynn, you...
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I agree. I think the pressures at the moment on children's social care, are at an all-time high. More children in care now than ever before. 83,840 was the last figure. That's an increase of 23% over the last decade. And I think, as Katharine says, it comes at the same time as what we've seen is a reduction in available resources to meet that need. And what that means for local authorities is very, very difficult decisions for directors of children's services who are required to meet their statutory obligations, but are having to disinvest in early help and early intervention. And I think that funding position is becoming increasingly precarious in local authorities. So we've seen a number of Section 114 notices issued now, and the LGA recently reported nearly 1 in 5 councils are concerned about bankruptcy in the next 2 years. So what that means is that the system is very much focused on late intervention, and very much at the high end, as opposed to intervening at an earlier time when actually change might be possible within families. We did some research with other leading children's charities, and funding for early intervention services has reduced significantly, 45% over the last 12 years reduction in early intervention services. But there is actually a fiscal and a human case for investment in early intervention. We did a cost-benefit analysis of some work that Barnardo's runs on the Isle of Wight. It's an intensive family support service. And we found that for every £1 invested in the service, the saving in costs to the state was £2.60. So there is a fiscal, there is an economic case for investment in early intervention, and I'm sure that many local authorities would like to invest there, but have to currently spend their money on meeting their statutory duties.
Early intervention is very important, Will, but what is your advice to government? What can they do to reverse this trend in demand?
One of the things that could be done, is to ring fence resource for early intervention and prevention. One of the recommendations that we've made through a children's charity coalition manifesto, which we have recently published, is to suggest that there is also a greater proportion of expenditure ring-fenced for children and young people. And that's one of the things that we would call for. I think that does provide protection. It would ensure that money was invested and would continue to be used for prevention. But there is also, of course, a requirement for some flexibility at a local level, because I think, as Will alluded to earlier, that there are differences in local authority areas that need to be taken into consideration.
I mean, that's easily said, Lynn, about ring fencing, because you've said in a few previous sentences there that money's being taken from early intervention to perform statutory duties. So therefore, if you ring fence the money for early intervention, that then will probably lead to a shortfall in money to perform statutory duties in crisis management. So what's the solution to that then? I mean, you're just moving the solution from one place to another from a financial perspective. Now, I mean, I would say, let's invest in our children's services to a much greater extent, because it's quite clear that from everything which is being said, there is a shortfall there. But if you ring fence one pot, you're going to have a shortfall in another pot.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the challenge is, if you don't invest in earlier intervention and prevention services, you never turn off that demand for late intervention and crisis services, which we know are very expensive. That's where local authorities are spending a lot of their money. I think there are other things that could be looked at across the system, and you asked a question earlier about corporate parenting duties. To see an extension of corporate parenting across a range of different agencies, I think would provide additional resource to support children in care and children leaving care. But unless we do something differently, this is not something that we are going to be able to address.
Could I just add a point on that? I think as well, when we look at the system, there isn't no money in the system. When we look at the provision of children's homes, for example, residential care, 85% of those are provided by private providers, some of whom, not all, but some of whom are making 20% profits. So I think that is not the only answer, but I think, it's not as simple as there being no money. There is a question over how we spend that money. And I do think there are questions when we have the system in the kind of crisis that it is about what is acceptable in terms of levels of profit. And there are elements of profiteering. And I think there are questions over how we address that in the round.
Yeah.
Okay, so in their 2023 risk register, DFE identified the children's social care market at risk of failure. Do you agree with this assessment? And do you think issues are regional or national?
Yeah, I would agree with that assessment. I think the risk is very high. The Competition and Markets Authority did an inquiry particularly looking at the provision of the private provision of residential care, and it sounded similar alarm bells to what's on the DFE's register. So I think you do have a system that is at crisis point, that is completely overwhelmed, and you have local authorities saying this is the single biggest area of overspend for them, children's social care. And, we're seeing local authorities facing serious financial difficulties. So in answer to whether it's a national or a local problem, I think it's both. I think it is an issue that is affecting local authorities across the country. There are local elements to it as well. There are different kind of factors and drivers in different areas. So I think it's both a national problem and it needs national oversight, but there are local factors which come into play in different areas too.
You want to add anything? Okay, that's fine.
I mean, the market is working in the sense if you want to make lots of money. The market's not working if you're a council that's absolutely strapped for cash. And something's gone really badly wrong and it needs to be looked at really, really quickly. I would also say that later on, and as I said before, early intervention is important, but later on when young people are leaving the care system, they're also feeling the impact of leaving care with councils that are cash strapped, because there is a tendency to kind of go, okay, you're 21 or you're 18, you're off the books almost, and we don't have to really think about you. And that has an impact on young people who are leaving the care system, maybe trying to get bursaries, maybe trying to go into education, employment help. They kind of disappear far too early. And that's because they're strapped for cash. That's the only, it's not that people don't care. It's that if you're looking at who do we help next, we help the 17-year-old, not the person who's 19 or 20. And so they're just disappearing now.
We're seeing more of that. Councils trying to cut back that support and bring the age forward of the support they provide to care leavers, definitely. And I think it's also just worth adding, because we've talked a lot about the impact on local authorities and finances, and that's extremely important. But, the real people who are suffering here are the children and young people themselves, and we are seeing that in their experience of the care system with very high levels of instability, young people often being moved a great distance away from everything and everyone they know. So there's a real human impact for children in the system now.
Yeah. And on that very point, I'll bring in Nick.
Just before I go on to the questions that I've got here, the children that are coming in, do we have the statistics on boys and girls? How many boys are coming in and how many girls do we actually have?
Yeah, I don't have them in front of me, but there are, I think, most statistics. Yeah, certainly.
That we could have. And it's saying, do you carry any data on children coming from separated families?
I don't think that's recorded, but I can double check for you.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Moving on to the questions in front of me, we know from recent data that 17,630 children in care were placed more than 20 miles away from their home. You've recently launched a campaign calling for government to stop out of area placements. What steps can the government take to reduce this? It is a huge issue. I mean, I've got about 3 care homes in Doncaster that have closed down, and we've got an ongoing case with that. And I genuinely do believe that if parents can see the children easily, then they could obviously probably see if something's not quite right. Yeah. I think parents are probably best placed to do that. With them more than 20 miles away, that can be a real stretch for some families to get to them. So
absolutely. I think so. We have seen an increase in the numbers of children being placed at great distance from their local area, and what that means for children is having to leave their school or possibly commute a couple of hours a day back. So huge disruption to their education, separated from their friends, separated from their community, often moved to a different area of the country they just don't know at all. And we know how much variety there is across the country. It can be very different moving from somewhere in the south to somewhere in the northwest, for example. And really tragically, we see brothers and sisters being separated as well, and those relationships are vital for all of us, but I think particularly if you're in care, those relationships with your siblings can be so crucial. But sadly, because of the pressure on the care system and the distances that children are being moved, with 1 in 5 of all children in care being moved more than 20 miles away, we're seeing more and more of that kind of separation and disruption. And also, it's worth adding, it's not that you are moved once 20 miles away and then you have an opportunity to kind of settle there. You might be moved frequently. We know a high proportion of children are moved multiple times, often to different parts of the country. So these are children who've been through a lot of trauma in coming into the care system, and then they don't have that stability, that opportunity to rebuild their lives and heal from some of that trauma, because the care system replicates some of it by moving them around, causing a huge amount of instability. And I think if you think about your own children, if you've ever moved house and moved their school, the kind of thought and consideration you put into that and how they're going to settle in a new area. For children in care, it might be, we're moving you next week to this area you've never heard of. So it's a real problem, and it's getting worse.
Why are the, two questions. Why are they moved? And ask that one, answer that one first, and then I'll follow up with another one.
They're moved because there are not enough places for them to live. So local authorities are scrabbling around to find wherever they can, and often that might not be in the local area. And they're also moved because
why?
of a lack of sufficiency means that the places that they're placed in the first place are often not a good match, or might be a temporary or short-term placement because that's all that's available, might not meet their needs, and so they, either the plan was it was only ever temporary, or the placement breaks down because there hasn't been a good match, and so that's the kind of frequent moves.
So, would you think it's, even though it's very disruptive for a child to be moved from one place to another, if they're moving closer to home, would you say that that's always that it's still a good move, even though it might be disruptive?
So there are some children for whom, it is the right thing to move them away from their local area, for example, if they're safeguarding issues. But what if there's a gang or something, a reason they're unsafe in their local area, there are absolutely valid reasons to move children away. However, what we're seeing with the rise is that, and our suspicion is that the majority of the moves are not because of the child's best interest, they're because of a lack of availability. And one of the things that we've called for is to distinguish between those two, so we can understand those children who are being moved when it's genuinely in their best interest, and those who are being moved because there's nothing else for them. And we'd like to see that recorded, and that's one of the things that we've called for.
Can I just bring Anna in quickly, and then Mohammed? I think we've got lots of people wanting to comment on this. So.
Thank you very much, Chair. Yes, you've mentioned that this is a real problem and getting worse, children being placed 20 miles or so away, and you mentioned the disruption to their education in terms of travel, but there's also the disruption in terms of having to settle into a new school. So are you tracking the educational attainment for that cohort that are being moved, so that there might be an evidence base to show how bad for them educationally that is?
I think that's a really good question. I don't know if that data is recorded. What we do know is that the well-being scores of those children who move further away are worse than for other children. It would be interesting to look into, and I can certainly take it away, whether that, you would imagine that will also impact on education. And we know as well there's no kind of regard for where a child might be in their educational journey, so it could be like bang smack in the middle of your exams that you're moved. And we hear of that happening frequently, or just coming up. So of course it's going to have, a real impact, I think, on their ability to do that.
Sorry.
Thank you.
So how difficult it is for you to tell us that how many out-of-area placements are appropriate due to specialised care needs, and how many are inappropriate, because there's hardly any data available.
Yeah, well, we don't know because it's not recorded in that way, and that's one of the things we think needs to happen, because there will be children for whom out of area placements. And actually we say it's less focusing on out of area, because if you take somewhere like London, for example, you could be in a different borough but actually not that far from your local area. We think the distance away that you're placed is more important, actually. But we don't have those figures, and we think that would be a really important thing to understand, actually.
I think it's you've got people in care who are living quite fragmented lives because of what's happened to them, and I think you're right, they meet a very fragmented system, and that is a recipe for failure, really. And one of the messages we get is about continuity and consistency is really, really, really important, and that's what the system should be trying to provide. But it almost feels that almost everything is set against that. It's actually, people have given so many hurdles to get over that the idea of consistency and continuity is never going to be attained. And if we're going to look at anything, we really need to get a grip with that. Because, particularly with education, it's disastrous. I think it's disastrous because people find it very hard to focus. People change schools. I mean, I was talking to somebody yesterday. She said, when I went to care, I changed schools, and because I was care leave, I was put in lower sets. Yeah, because there's trouble and all this kind of stuff, and that's not unusual.
But is there not a simple economic imperative as to why so many of the places which are available for young people out of borough are where they are?
Yeah.
Right. Well, put it on the record, for goodness sake. You know?
Absolutely. I think one of the factors so there is a general issue with sufficiency. There is also an issue with where, particularly with children's homes, so less so with foster care, but particularly with children's homes, they are concentrated in areas where property is cheaper and they don't match the need in those local areas.
And what also happens, though, is that you get in areas where property is cheaper, quite often the local services aren't particularly brilliant either, are they?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's one of the things, actually, that young people who have left care have also told us that they experience in terms of being able to access accommodation through private arrangements. They are often, as a result of being care leavers, disadvantaged in that. But I do think, there are some fundamental reforms of commissioning arrangements that need to take place to address some of the issues that we have just been talking about here. So we really support the work of Become on this area. What we're concerned about are the increased risks of exploitation for children and young people who are moved and who are moved away from support networks, who have discontinuity both of care but also some of the wider protective systems that children interface with, like schools, and so disruption in education exposes them to further risk. And we know statistically that children and young people in care and leaving care are overrepresented in the not in education, employment or training stats. So these are long-term significant impacts. But the high dependency on the private sector to provide homes, I think 78% of homes are now provided by the private sector, does mean that factors like the price of housing are driving decisions about where homes are established, rather than those decisions being made on the basis of the needs of children and young people within the population.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just
Sorry.
We need say something about, because you mentioned residential care. I mean, we think it's really important that people see the value of residential care. Really, really important. A couple of years ago, somebody put a question out on one of the private Facebook pages that I run, saying, what was your time in a children's home like? And there was about 100 responses, and I went through and counted them all. And something like 30% said they really enjoyed it. It was the best thing that had ever happened to them, and they felt safe there. And it's really worth bearing in mind that it will always have a place in the system. It will. And for some people, it's a really good option, because you don't want to go back into a small house when you've just come from a small house, when some bad things might have happened. You know, that can feel threatening in itself. Larger establishments can give you space, you know, that you might need as an individual when you've gone through a very traumatic experience, and that's quite an important thing as well. So there needs to be a supply of really good residential accommodation that is actually seen as very high quality and is seen as necessary. Because our feeling is that over the last 30 to 40 years, it's been there's been a move to kind of downplay it, thinking that family care is always best. And for about a third of care leavers, that's not true. And that's why you get a lot of people, you know, moving around the system, because they can't cope with small children's homes, they can't cope with foster care. So we need to do some serious thinking about that.
Nick?
Yeah, I mean, a freedom of information request was put into Doncaster Council about the annual placement of individual child in the financial year 2022-23, a child that was actually attending mainstream school, and the highest annual placement cost was £677,857. Yeah. We've heard of the £1 million child as well. I mean, these are extraordinary amounts of money. So do you believe that it's not a lack of money going into the system, it's how that money is actually being utilised? Because £677,000 for a local council to spend on one placement of a child who's in mainstream school is mind-blowing to most people.
I think it's a bit of both. There are some children who have very complex needs, who need round-the-clock care, who may need a couple of workers for them, and it can be expensive to accommodate them. However, when those places are being provided by companies who make 20% profit on them, then I think there are questions to ask about how we are spending that money and whether it could be better spent and reinvested in the system. So there are questions around profiteering. It is also an underfunded system, and I think both things can be.
I mean, 20% is just a usual business. The businesses want to make 20%, and profit shouldn't be a swear word, and obviously they'll be paying tax on those profits and so on and so forth, so forth, so forth. But £677,000 for a child that's attending mainstream school, there's something broken there, isn't there, for that to happen? And it's crippling councils up and down the country. This is not a Doncaster issue. This is up and down the country. So we really need to look at what we can do with this. Plus the fact that obviously these children it shouldn't be about the money, or it should always be about what's best for that child. I'm sure £677,000 has not been spent very wisely there. I'm sure it hasn't. It can't be. I mean, you can go to Eton for whatever that costs, can't you? I mean, it's just huge sums of money here.
Yeah, they're huge sums of money when we're talking about an individual child, and I don't think we've properly looked into the whole system. And actually, I think one of the big areas missing in the government's plans was really looking into that issue of sufficiency. They talk about commissioning, and commissioning is part of the picture, but it's not the whole picture. I think there's an issue around supply and provision more generally that hasn't really been looked into and should be.
Do you want one more, and then I'll go to Flick?
Okay, thank you. You have described the consequences of out-of-area placement for children and young people in the care. You have recently launched a campaign asking the government to stop out-of-area placements. What do you think, what steps government can take to reduce the number of out-of-area placements?
We think there needs to be a national commitment to placing children far from home. We think there needs to be a national strategy, because it is a national issue, particularly when you're getting children placed at different parts of the country. It needs to be looked at in the round, but there also needs to be local plans too. A significant number of councils don't produce sufficiency plans, even though they are required to. So we think that needs addressing. We think there needs to be better monitoring and accountability as well. So I mentioned recording that difference between placements which are in a child's best interest and those placements made because there's no other places available, and we think that needs to happen. So a number of measures which look to improve this situation.
You need a pretty good coding system to get that right, wouldn't you? Because what you wouldn't want is a situation where every time a council just said, oh, it's in my child's best interest because we have to do it. I mean, that's... Definitely.
It would need some thought about how you make that work, but I don't believe, that's beyond the wit of...
Bringing Flick.
So going back to unaccompanied asylum seeker children, so you mentioned that there were 7,000, which must have a massive impact on the rising demand, but also out of area placements. What impact is it actually having?
Yeah, happy to. Do you want to?
Just on that out of area placements particularly, it's worth noting that unaccompanied asylum seeking children are much more likely to be placed in supported accommodation than in children's homes. If you're asking, does it map, there's more unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, so more children are being placed out of area. That's definitely not the case, because actually it's more likely that their location is less likely to be recorded. Unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the distance place is less, so it's not contributing to the rise in the numbers of children who it's being recorded are being placed further away.
That's helpful.
Yeah, no, not at all. So I think it's important to just recognise that unaccompanied asylum-seeking children account for fewer than 1 in 10 children in care, but the number is growing. So the increase went from 5,100 back in 2019 to 7,200 in 2023. So of course, the need for provision that effectively meets their needs has also increased significantly. And I think it's important to recognise the level of trauma that many unaccompanied asylum-seeking children experience. and the need to meet that with specialist provision is also very important. I mean, after the recent judgment, of course, hotel accommodation has now been closed, but as Katharine said, many young people are in supported accommodation provision. The Children's Commissioner, her recent report examining homelessness found that of the 6,000 children aged 16 and 17 who were presenting as homeless in 2022 to 23, 18% were unaccompanied children seeking asylum. So we know that there is a lot of unmet need, and unaccompanied children must be taken into care when they arrive in the UK so that they can start to get the help that they need, having faced the issues that they have. We ran back in 2010 a safe accommodation project which provided specialist placements for children and young people who are at risk or victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking. And that programme involved providing foster carers with a range of training to enable them to better meet the specific needs of those children. We employed specialist workers, and the outcomes from that programme were really positive. It was very effective in meeting needs. So we think that should be part of a strategic plan for welcoming all refugee children and children seeking asylum, and give them the best possible start to life. But that would require investment, of course, in specialist foster care placements, or, if appropriate, access to supported accommodation with the right wraparound level of support. So the National Foster Recruitment Campaign should contain a specific target for recruiting foster carers for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children to meet that need. And we could have some bespoke and targeted approaches within that wider campaign. And also work with the sector, who have been doing a lot of work in this area to develop training and the right level of support to provide that specialist care that's required.
Out of those 7,000, how many are actually receiving specialist care and help? Or are there ones falling through the gaps?
Don't have that data available to me now, but I think the findings from the Children's Commissioner report that I noted earlier give some cause for concern about the level of homelessness.
Yeah. Is there any further steps you think that the government should be doing to provide appropriate care and protection under the 1989 Children's Act? Or is everything in place? Because we talked about legislation before. Is there any further legislation that's needed? Was it all there already? Fine.
I think a lot of it comes down, probably in this area, less to legislation and more to sufficiency and the availability of specialist placements. Yeah. Like Lynn said, that there aren't enough, and a high proportion of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children are placed into a supported accommodation rather than into care, so they won't receive care in those settings, they'll only receive support. That is a wider issue, which maybe we'll come onto, but there has been a big increase in the number of 16 and 17-year-olds being placed in supported accommodation, which might be a hostel or a B&B or even a barge or caravan, and not receiving the same level of care that younger children are receiving. And that's got worse since the introduction of a new regulatory regime around that.
So there's still quite a lot of these unaccompanied asylum children who are in children's.
Yes, exactly. There's
what percentage?
I can get you the exact percentage, but it's a higher proportion of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children than other children that.
Yeah, because presumably quite a few of them in the hotels which are slowly closing, then they've found places for them, or they may end up on the streets, I suppose.
Yeah, so they will be placed in hostels, in B&Bs, or in other forms of.
Yeah, which is inappropriate for children. Yeah.
Can I just say something about the specialist services, which is that it's actually reflective of a wider problem in the system, which is that a lot of young people in care have experienced trauma. And having looked at the review and having looked at the response to it, we just don't see a sufficient response in terms of specialist care for children who have post-traumatic stress. And it's a case that sometimes if you're 16 and you're trying to get into CAMS, people say forget it because it won't appear until you're an adult. I mean, it's that bad. And so it must be worse for asylum-seeking children as well. And the thing to remember about this is that you are storing up trouble. I mean, we get for those individuals, you know, you get people who are 40 ringing us up, talking to us about the need to access the files and having lived with something for 25 years and it only now coming to the front of their minds at a time of crisis. So certainly for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, definitely, but wider across the system, there is just an absence of specialist care. And it's a big issue, I think.
Just on that though, how much of that specialist care should be being commissioned through the care system versus getting CAMS working really effectively and scaling up what's on offer there, making sure it's being delivered through the health system?
It should be a mix, but what you'd want to see is that if a child is having particular problems, they can get a resource through the childcare system or the local authority, wherever it comes from. People are alerted to it and the resource is there.
And I mean, just thinking about some of the points that were being made earlier about corporate parenting and extending that to other bodies, presumably if that were being extended to local health organisations, that would help in that regard.
Yes, I think it would. I think it's a good idea. There's just one caveat while we're on corporate parenting. A lot of care leavers don't like the phrase. Yeah. It feels completely cold. We're not suggesting that we've got a better idea, but we need to come up with one.
Okay, thank you. Ian?
Right, we're talking earlier on about early intervention, and you know I saw the interesting figures from the pilot in Isle of Wight about the £1 spent on early intervention saving £2.60 down the line. I mean, so we've kind of skirted into that territory, but is there anything in particular you can think of that we can do to improve early intervention apart from the money?
Well, I think we've talked about some of the pressures that need to be balanced here, and I recognise that is a challenge. But I think we do need an effective reform programme that looks at helping families sooner and getting the right support to those who can't live with their birth parents. There has been a significant increase in children in care who are living in semi-independent accommodation in recent years, and that's as a result of increasing numbers of older children coming into care for whom it is often more difficult to find suitable placement. So the contention is that by concentrating on earlier intervention, a reform programme could help more children to stay safely with their families through that sort of intensive support, and would also correspondingly reduce pressures in the system, so councils can provide a better level of care then for those children who do need it. So I talked earlier about a national foster carer recruitment campaign. I think that would help. I think it would also really help to do that with the voluntary sector, to recruit a range of carers to meet the needs of all children. We've talked about the diversity of the population of children who need care today. The scheme at the moment only focuses on local authority recruitment, and of course there are a number of independent fostering and adoption agencies within the sector. An expansion of the current independent visitor programme would also be helpful, so that every child who wants to have access to an independent visitor, a buddy or a mentor to support them during their time in care, can have one. And they would have, if we were to introduce an opt-out offer of advocacy, they would have that by default. And should they determine that they don't want it, then they can opt out of it. But it's really important, I think, in any reform programme that the views, wishes, experiences and interests of children and young people are given full account of. I quoted earlier some of the statistics around the shift in spend, so a reduction of just over 3.7 billion since 2010-11, a fall of almost half in the investment in early intervention, and reversing that trend I think is absolutely critical if we want a system that effectively meets the needs of children. We do a practitioner survey quite frequently within Barnardo's, and workers in some of our family help services are also telling us that the lack of funding and priority for early help family support services means that the thresholds are getting higher, and it's getting harder and harder to meet the levels of demand in our services. Cases that are coming through the front door are no longer the cases that we would necessarily class as early help. So it's that presenting complexity as a result of not having sufficient investment that we're starting to see unfold. I will just finish by talking about a report that we did in collaboration with other children's charities that was called the Cost of Delay Report. And that found, the research in that report found that delays to reform children's social care will cost public finances an extra $1 billion over the next 10 years. So a failure to invest in the long term will lead to a very significant budgetary problem. We've long called for a family hub in every community.
We as a committee.
Yes.
We're
of one accord in that.
Yeah. And that, I mean, we've looked at obviously from the perspective of the early years particularly, but actually particularly valid here in terms of the help and support that can be delivered.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, on the ground, I mean, certainly, you know, the feedback I get from talking to teachers in schools, for instance, as a good example is that when they sort of have a concern about a child, the thresholds for intervention by children's social services seem to have gone up and up and up. Yeah. And therefore, we've moved right away from the early intervention in many localities in terms of ending up in crisis management situations quite often. And, that in itself has probably been one of the biggest drivers to the fact that the number of youngsters in the care of local authorities have gone up and up and up.
Yeah, and I think Katharine started by talking about the impact of poverty. I think the cost of living crisis is a real issue for the children and families that we work with within Barnardo's. Schools, we run the attendance pilots in a number of schools, and we know that poverty and the impact of poverty is one of the challenges for children and young people getting into school, having the correct uniform, having money to be able to travel to school, having money for lunches, and actually for lots of children who are in care, that is also highly problematic.
Now, Will, in your written evidence, you stated that much of the focus of the government strategy, Stable Homes Built on Love, was on early intervention at the expense of children in the care system and care leavers. So how can the government provide an effective balance between focusing on current children in care and preventing children from going into care in the future?
Good question. I mean, it all is all down to resource. And it's all down to providing the right services, really, to get that balance right. I mean, to be honest, our focus is also on when you get after 25 and the effects of life after you've left the care system. And this is why actually getting it right really early on is important, because you don't want to end up with people who have significant social problems or very poor outcomes. So I would ask you I want to stretch your mind in terms of what is a care leaver, because it can be for many people a lifelong experience, and that really needs to be borne in mind. And there's some data that was produced by the Nuffield Foundation. I don't think they've put it into their submission, but in 2021, looking at mortality where they're saying falling rates of premature mortality in the general population are not mirrored in the care leaver population. Adults who spent time in care as children between 1971 and 2001 were 70% more likely to die prematurely than those who did not. The extra risk of premature death rose for care leavers from 40% in 1971 to 360% in 2011. Right? And that tells you that something's going really wrong. So it is about early intervention, it is about continuity of care, and it is about not shutting the door when somebody's 25.
Yeah.
It's really important because this affects the health system, it affects the prison system, it affects the mental health system. And, you know, we've got to think about it in a much more long-range way. One final thing I would say on that, if we're going to go the whole way, which is that we're starting to do some work with colleagues in Australia about what happens to care leavers if they need to go into elderly care and the impact it has on them. And it's important. So trying to stretch your mind a bit there about what a care leaver is and what the life experience is.
I mean, certainly, you know, and certainly the previous report that we did about leaving care, you know, we were struck then, and you know, it was something we kind of knew, but it reinforced our attitude, was that, you know, youngsters who've been through the care system become traumatised adults, and, you know, vulnerable and traumatised adults, they need continuing care, you know, because, I mean, you know, as adults ourselves and having kids, you know, you never stop caring for or loving your kids, but, you know, those youngsters, the most vulnerable youngsters, quite often traumatised youngsters, become adults with the same problems. Yeah. And, you know, they need that additional support.
Yeah.
I think that's right. Oh, sorry,
There you
go. Very sadly, 1 in 3 young people leaving care become homeless within 2 years of leaving the care system.
There's a significant correlation between the prison population and people who've come out of the care system as well.
Absolutely, and part of the reason for that is the care cliff that young people face when they come to leave care, the very abrupt transition into adulthood that's kind of forced upon them often well before they're ready. So overnight, and for many young people on their 18th birthday, they have to leave the care system, and that often means moving out of the accommodation that they're in, many becoming homeless. So there really needs to be something done about that care cliff and ending that care cliff that sees too many young people struggling into adulthood.
And with that in mind, do you think, do all your organisations agree with the idea of making care experience a protected characteristic? Do you have any views on that? Are there any potential downsides of doing that?
I think there are growing calls from the care experience community for it to be made a protected characteristic. There are a mix of views, so there's not unanimity, and I think more needs to be done to understand the views of the care experience community. A lot of local authorities have voluntarily adopted the idea of care experience as a protected characteristic, so it'll be important to understand what's happening in those local areas and what more legislation could potentially bring and the kind of outcomes that it could achieve. So we think there needs to be more work.
Needs to be explored as a Lynn.
Yeah, I do think it's really important to recognise the stigma and discrimination, you know, that is quite real for many children in care and who are leaving care. And I gave an example earlier of how difficult it is for young people who are leaving care to sometimes get accommodation through private rental arrangements. And of course, you know, there are solutions to those things which we could do now without any requirement to change legislation in respect of a protected characteristic. So, for example, things like a guarantor scheme and a deposit scheme runs very successfully in Kent. Very low default rate would mean that young people would have access to better quality accommodation in better areas. That doesn't necessarily require us to place an equalities duty, and of course there would inevitably be some delay in doing so. We talked earlier about the opportunity to potentially extend the corporate parenting principles, which is also something that could be done without young people having to have a protected characteristic as being care experienced. So it's interesting, and I think the exploration of it is right. There are, there's a diversity of opinion about it, but I think what's important is that we don't lose sight of what we can do, irrespective of whether or not we do introduce that as a protected characteristic. So, my concern would be just about not delaying things that we could put in place right now that would really alleviate some of the pressures for young people.
Yeah. And Will, amongst your members, is that diversity of views?
Yes, but broadly in favour.
Right.
Don't think of it as a panacea. Mm-hmm. What you were making about services need to be good enough and need to be improved. And also there is questions raised about you can have a protected characteristic, but then that takes time to get through the system and lots of legal battles. Yeah. So broadly yes, but don't think of it as a solution.
And one of the things I was pleased to see in the care strategy was around the increases in bursaries for care leavers apprenticeships and some of those things. What else do you think needs to be done to improve participation in further higher and vocational education for care leavers?
So I think a big factor in children not doing well in education is the care cliff. So you're right in the middle of your exams, you might have to be leaving care and trying to find somewhere else to live. And that happens at 18, but actually in truth you start to think about it a long time before that, so you will be worrying about that as a teenager, and that can be very difficult to kind of focus on your studies. The growing numbers of 16 and 17 year olds being placed in supported accommodation, which could be really difficult places to do your homework, to study. You might have limited access to Wi-Fi, there might be noise and problems, and we know that can be really challenging for young people. And also the instability within the care system itself. It's very hard to focus on school and education if you're being moved around, having to change school, and worrying about all of those things rather than being able to kind of focus on school. So I think there's a whole set of stuff around school itself, and there's lots more that universities could do, I think, to encourage young people. I think there's something about raising aspirations earlier. Often we have lower aspirations for our care experienced young people than we should do, and I think those conversations need to start earlier about the possibility in the future and the support that young people need to do well in school and university and work.
Are you aware of any universities that are doing particularly good work in this space?
So there are some universities universities. There has been progress, and I think universities will often have a named contact who can provide particular support to care experienced young people. Some universities provide year-round accommodation because, of course, for care experienced young people, they may not have somewhere to go in the holidays. And some universities do outreach, and we work with a lot of universities doing some good work in this space. So there are things happening. There is additional support for care experienced young people at universities. There is some financial support available. I would say awareness of it is lower than it should be, so there's something really about making sure children at school know about that early enough to think that university is an option for them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, we work with a number of care experienced young people who are at university and are doing well there, but actually raising their ambition and aspiration is dependent upon them understanding that there are support mechanisms that are available to them within that environment. We recently published a report called No Bank of Mum and Dad, which does highlight some of the challenges for young people who move on to university, things like accommodation, out of term time, if you have something that breaks down, if you need to travel, just some of the finances that are available to young people. One of the challenges that I think could be addressed is that young people who are care experienced under 25 receive the lower rate of universal credit, and of course many of them are living independently and have exactly the same expensive cost of living pressures as anybody of any other age, but they also don't necessarily have the family support and networks to fall back upon, and I think that is a potential barrier. We run an education, employment and training programme over in Lincolnshire, actually, and one of the things that we recognise is that this particular population of care experienced young people, because of a lot of the discontinuity that they have had, the wraparound support is really important to help them not just engage, but to maintain their engagement over the long term when they hit a bump in the road. So higher ratios of staff, outreach work, really assertive provision and outreach work, some flexibility to be afforded, and holistic support for things like mental health and housing support as and when it's needed. Those have been the things that have enabled young people to stay the course and achieve really positive outcomes in employment, training and education provision.
And just to add, we run a service called Propel, which brings together information about what all the universities and colleges across the UK offer for care experienced young people, and it varies, but there is support out there. And we also support young people thinking about going to university or moving into work, their journey to get there, so that might be helping them with their UCAS statement or understanding what extra support they can access, and critically when they're at university, helping them stay there, because often care experienced young people are more likely to drop out of university because of the different challenges they face in their non-care experienced peers.
And have you got good information about the ones who are doing it well, and information about the ones who aren't, shall we say, could do so with some improvement?
It's not really a judgment as such. It kind of more tells you what's there, who the named contact is. So it's really for young people to be able to think, if I'm thinking of going to that university, what help might be there for me. But there is, as you'd imagine, there is variety, and I do think there's more universities could do. I think they could also think more about their admissions process and looking at contextualised admissions, so taking into account the circumstances and the barriers that care experienced young people have faced to get even to the point where they might be thinking about
presumably
university.
The change of design in the UCAS form and the focus on asking questions and focusing on barriers is welcome from that perspective.
Yeah, I think it's important that young people have the opportunity to explain their journeys and the kind of additional hurdles that they'll often have overcome, and the kind of I don't really like the word resilience, because I think there's an assumption that kind of hardship is in some way a good thing, but care experienced young people have had to demonstrate immense fortitude to kind of even be getting to the point where university is a possibility, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration, and the disruptions to their schooling that's often taken place. Often during exams they might have had to leave care or have moved place, so I think it would be good to see more universities taking that into account and thinking about who they offer places.
Will, bring your answer.
I'd like to think about later care leavers going back into education, because as you said, there's a lot of life experience there, and it may be only when you're 30 or 35 that you suddenly think, hang on, I didn't go to university and I should be going to university. And encouraging older care leavers back into the education system, I think, is really important. It is a missed opportunity, and they can, care leavers who are older can progress quite well in education because they have a lot of life experience to bring, really. And it might be worth thinking about offering some encouragement, because it can be a big step financially, to say, okay, you might be able to do this, and we're going to give you a bit of support because we recognise, because of your care experience, you missed out.
Interesting. And so, with the lifelong learning entitlement, there should be opportunities to perhaps have some support with that to actually encourage people to look at this later on.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. And just in terms of the FE part of that, how effective is the sector at engaging with people both in care and care leavers? Obviously, it doesn't have the same level of resource as the HE sector. But does it? Do you find that as a sector generally open to trying to support care?
I think again it's really variable. We do some work with FE colleges. We'll go in and we'll speak to staff, we'll speak to students who might be care experienced about the kind of particular challenges and barriers they might face and the support available. You're seeing both colleges and universities reaching out sometimes to schools or working with virtual school heads who have responsibility for care experienced children in their area. So there are initiatives happening and some positive steps, but like many of these things, it's patchy, some are better than others. It's certainly not consistent, and there is still not enough, in our opinion, of raising the aspirations of children at an early enough point that they can think about continuing an education in some form.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Andrew.
Thank you.
Very patiently.
Chairman? Yeah. So Lynn, could you elaborate on the statutory support scheme, some of the ideas you've got within that, and how practical that would be to roll out nationally, and what potential difficulties there may be in doing that?
Yeah, certainly. So we've had a couple of strategic partnerships with local authorities where we've been trialling different approaches to improve the offer to young people who are care experienced. We would like to see the publication of a national statutory offer of support for care leavers, which would really help to level the playing field, but also build on some of the best practice that we know is out there and provide the sort of consistency and continuity that we've talked about here today. So to give an illustration of that, free bus travel for care leavers is one of the things that we've looked at. So our Transport for Freedom report demonstrates how giving access to free bus travel can really help young people to access education, employment, training, but also other community assets, as well as, of course, really importantly, maintain contact with family and friends in their local area. Now, we estimate that to roll that out would cost approximately 77 million a year to implement. But what that free bus travel does for young people is means that they are more likely to be in employment, they are less likely to be experiencing loneliness and social isolation, and they are better able to contribute. That's one of the things that a young person said to me recently that was really important to them. Not having access to that free transport would have meant that they couldn't work, and if they can't work, they don't feel that they can make a valued contribution. And so that's one of the things that we would like to see. A comprehensive accommodation offer is really important, so improved access for the stay in put scheme so that more care leavers can stay with their foster parents for longer. That would, of course, require us to look at allowances for foster carers after children turn 18, especially for those who are still in education. And a national rollout of the staying close scheme is something that we think would also be very, very helpful. I referenced earlier the challenge with universal credit. So all care experienced young people who are claiming universal credit should really receive the over 25 rate of universal credit. They often struggle to make ends meet. They receive the lower rate of benefits, and they don't have families that they can lean into when they're in need of additional support. We find it increasingly the case that just the essentials, you know, the very bare essentials of food, energy, transport are a real challenge, and they are not any cheaper because they are younger. And so a change there, I think, would really help. Access to mental health support we've talked about today already, but a lead for mental health in every local authority area. The issue, I think, is about swift and easy access to mental health support. So that's the challenge. And Katharine talked earlier about the cliff edge in support when young people reach 18. That transition into adult services is also something that is a real challenge for many young people. And if we were to extend with some consistency the role of the virtual school head, as you talked about earlier, that would also support in respect of further and higher education for young people who are in care and care experienced. So those are some of the things. The role of the private sector, I think, is also important here. So we've been doing some work recently as part of a 2-year partnership with the Bank of England, for example, that looks at financial education and financial inclusion for young people, many of whom find it quite difficult to access bank accounts. They often don't have the documentation that they need to do that, but also they don't have the financial literacy. And so there are, I think, partnerships that we can look at that can also increase the support to young people and have a very positive impact. The Care Leavers Covenant, I think, is an important first step in some of that, and has really amplified, I think, the needs of this group of children and young people, and given better recognition to that. So a step in the right direction.
Thank you. So just to sort of round up, really, I mean, when I was leader of Derbyshire County Council, 2009 to 13, it's a bit of a gloomy reflection that all of these issues were exactly the same issues that we were discussing at the time, and all of the desire to improve the outcomes were all of the same, and the results have, alas, been all of the same as well. So wanted to ask all of you really specifically what you think national and local government can do to prioritise voices of looked after children and care leavers when reforming the care system. Start with you, Will.
Yeah, the issue of voice of care leavers, I think, is really important. There's been some very good work done by other organisations for younger care leavers. I think it's important to recognise that older care leavers, as they leave the system, they reflect on it. As they get older, they reflect on it more, and they can be an enormous resource in terms of how to shape systems that work. And that needs to be taken into account. And we don't really feel that experience is listened to, because you have people say you battle through the system and you get out of the system at the other end, and then you need a period of reflection, and then you can start talking about what you think could be done better. And there are lots of older care leavers who want to help, actually, and who have life experience that you should draw on. And government should do that, and we don't think it's being done well enough.
Thank you, Katharine.
I think absolutely listening to the voices of children and young people as well. They know what needs to change in the system, and they're often very brilliant advocates for that. I think more broadly we know what needs to change, and the two big things for us is improving stability within the system itself, so that children are moved left and they're kept closer to their home area, and then getting rid of the care cliff that so many young people face as they age out of care. We know what needs to change, we know what the kind of policy changes that are needed are, and it now needs to have the political priority and the investment and the urgency to back that up.
Thank you. And Lynn?
Yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree that the expertise and the experience of children and young people is really important. Here we had a group of young people actually who fed in directly to the review itself, and came up with a checklist of things that they felt were important that they shared with Josh McAllister at the time. We've also recently been contracted by the Department for Education to provide opportunities for children and young people to have their voices heard as the reform programme develops. Our key learning so far, I think, is that you need to include a range of different methodologies for engaging with children and young people, interactive opportunities, opportunities for them to be able to pose direct questions to policy teams, and to receive meaningful responses. I think that's what's really important. But there are a range of techniques that we can also use to collate anonymous feedback, including from marginalised groups within the care population, but we have to look beyond consultation here and further than young people just sharing their experiences. So some of the work that we've done, for example, in some local areas, is to have teams of young inspectors, which has enabled them to have some say on the quality and the sufficiency of provision in their area. So we think it's really important it, and if, as a committee, there was an interest in engagement with children and young people who are care experienced, then we would also be very happy to support and facilitate that.
Well, I'm grateful for that, and I think that's certainly something that further into the inquiry we will be looking to engage with all of your organisations around, because I think that is definitely an opportunity we want to take. I'm very grateful for the evidence from this panel. If we can switch panels to a second, that would be great. Thank you.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
Apologies if I get the pronunciation wrong here, but on the second panel we have, is it Dinithi, Wijedasa, and Professor Jane Thoburn, Professor at the University of East Anglia, Dinithi is from Bristol University, and Dr. Ray Jones, Professor at Kingston University, our academic panel. And so if I can start by just asking some general question on the government's implementation strategy. Does it place enough resource on reunifying children with their birth families, in your opinion? And also, I'm just interested with the broader question of how our system compares with other international systems. I appreciate it's very difficult to draw direct comparisons when different systems work in different ways, but any examples you can give us that we ought to be learning from in the international space, any systems which you see as potential models for improvement, I think we'd be very interested in learning about from your knowledge and experience as academics in the sector. So who would like to start on that?
June, I think.
June.
Children who come into care, and I'm here specifically to talk about children in care, my colleagues have more to say about family support, are special children. They've all suffered something, even if it's a baby who's lost the possibility of being brought up. They're special children, they need special targeted services for each child. And therefore, every option we have must be seen in its own right. And yes, reunification is really important for those who need it, as is kinship care. But they do need time in care in order to get the right option. And sometimes there's too much rush in the court system to keep them out or get them out of care, rather than staying in care. And there we need very high quality foster carers, so that they can work, and very high quality social workers. The elephant in the room is workforce. Foster carers, social workers, and I might say a little bit later, residential childcare workers.
Okay. And are there, I mean, can you point us towards some good examples of perhaps jurisdictions that are delivering that workforce more effectively?
Particularly in residential childcare, I think we do foster care, particularly long-term foster care, permanent foster care, we do better than most countries. We do adoption better than most countries. We do residential childcare, and particularly what I call ordinary children's homes, less well than most European countries particularly. Could we get rid of the notion of residential childcare as a last resort? That's because we use it as a last resort. Children who really need to be, young people, teenagers, in residential care, we let them fail 2 or 3 or more times, and then, of course, by the time they move into residential childcare, they have so many serious problems that they cost the sort of money that you heard about earlier.
And just on that point of other European countries which do residential care perhaps better or more effectively, which would be the models that you would propose we could learn most from? Again, recognising that different systems work in different ways. So.
Indeed, I'd have a look at Spain, I'd have a look at Germany. They have for long had more children entering care at an older age group than we have. And we're now increasing the age group at which our children are entering care. But I'd also say we need a mixed economy. We do need, broadly speaking, the Europeans have something like over 50% are provided by the state, quite a lot more by the voluntary sector, and a very much smaller number by the private sector. I think we really do need to reinvest in locally provided children's homes. And we've lost the expertise, sadly. Local authorities, sadly, have lost their expertise in providing children's homes.
And obviously there was a cultural move away from large institutions for children, which was probably in some respects a good thing. But then that doesn't seem to have been replaced, perhaps, with the smaller locally provided ones. And I guess the question would come, where would the budget come from in order for local authorities to do that? Is that something that the DFE should be commissioning for local authorities, in your view? Or?
Yes, I think it should. But over time, this is the dilemma, isn't it? That you can't starve the in-care children in order to build up the family support services. It has to be sort of twin-track funding so that we get high-quality services for children in care and leaving care at the same time as building up family support. But this is also about homelessness. These teenagers are coming into care because of appalling housing conditions.
Thoburn, can I ask you though? I mean, we've talked about how most European countries do children's homes better than the UK. Are there any specific examples which countries do it the best?
It's always difficult, isn't it, as to for what I call ordinary, high-quality children. What the Europeans provide is therapeutic parenting. They emphasise parenting, not necessarily therapy. It's whatever we do for children in care, they need to trust relationships. Foster carers, children's homes, their own families, their kinship carers. And children's homes need to provide that parenting as well as the therapeutic input that they might need.
Mr. James, do you want to come in on this?
Well, Chair, first of all, thank you for calling me an academic. I was for a part of my time a professor, but before that I was for 14 years a social services director. Yeah. For 50 years I've been a social worker. And even when I was a professor, for half of my time the government was sending me into areas in England which weren't seem to be doing very well in terms of children's services. So that's my background, and I've just done the review in Northern Ireland of their children's social care services as well. And I do think we overcomplicate things. I really do think we overcomplicate things, and we slice them up, reunification, foster care, residential care, whatever. And we forget to think about the experience of the child. Yeah. The child is seen as a commodity that gets moved between different services. And things have got decidedly worse over the last 10, 15 years. They really have. We've gone from a crisis to a calamity. Not because people out there aren't working really hard, they are working really hard. But we've got to a position now where I hope you are feeling anxious. I hope you actually might be feeling angry, because what's happening for children and families who are struggling in our communities is absolutely awful. So I think we actually have to need to clear some of the ground out. And one of the things about the reviews that have been undertaken, the government's response, is that they're all really good in terms of slicing things up and new initiatives about this. Bits of funding for that, but we're not getting down to the fundamental issue, which is that we've made it very difficult for parents who are well motivated but are increasingly ground down by poverty to care well for their children. We've made it very difficult for those within local communities, including local authorities, then to provide the help that's necessary for those families to help them to survive with their children. We've made it very difficult when the children themselves are finding that their lives are crumbling around them to be able to pick those children up and to care for them well. Now, none of that's rocket science. We know how to do this, but we've gone down a cul-de-sac over the last 12, 15 years, where now what we do is that we threaten families with child protection investigations. If we find that there's a real danger for children, we remove the children from that family. But what we don't do is we help families when they're beginning to struggle. And we don't really provide the help now for families when they actually need the help to care for their children well. So my view is that we got ourselves into a bit of a dilemma here. We've made it all very technical. We've all made it very specialist. We've all made it sliced up. And we have to get back to just calming it down, actually doing what we need to do for children and families within communities, if they're with their families or if they're not with their families. And the conversation isn't taking us in that direction at the moment.
And in those cases where they're not with their families, how do you make sure that that can be done in a less confrontational, less disruptive way? Because I think we've heard a lot about the importance of stability for those children and those arrangements.
Well, most of these children, you want to be with their families. That's where their identity is. You want the children to be with their families, if that's possible. You want to support those children with their families and the parents to parent well. And including if children can't at that point in time, be living with their parents, keep them local. We've heard this from the panel just now. Keep them local. See residential care and foster care as a community resource for children, rather than something that's done as a commercial enterprise a distance away from families and away from the communities where children live. So actually help to care for children in their local communities, still in contact with their siblings, with their parents, with their grandparents, etc., rather than what we do at the moment. We see it as a separate enterprise. You're either with your family or you're not with your family. And that's how we've cast it, and it's not a sensible position to have got to.
No. Okay. Thank you. And Dinithi,
I think I'll start with a statistic. You asked about reunifications. 40% of reunifications break down within the first 5 years. And that is because the parents do not have sufficient support over the years, continued support to maintain these reunifications. And I think like Ray and June said, for some children, they need to come into care. And once they come into care, we need to give them stable placements. And I think government strategy, which you mentioned previously, starts with stable homes built with love. I think the intention is brilliant. However, the system is not there yet. 45% of children in the last 2 years had more than 2 placements. 1 in 10 had 3 placements last year. When I call it a placement, it sounds inanimate. However, what this means is a breakdown in relationships each time. They are changing their carers, sometimes their school, sometimes their friends, their neighborhoods, each time this happens. And these statistics have not changed. I think one minister mentioned earlier, these have not changed over the last years. So what do we need to do then to stabilize the system? I think the sufficiency of carers, which the strategy addresses, it needs to be done. I think the children in care has increased by 7% in the last 5 years, whilst the number of carers have gone down by 6%. And last year, in terms of the net loss, we had a net loss of foster carers, the more left than the ones that joined the system. But apart from addressing the sufficiency, we've talked about out-of-area placements and having the exact number of carers that are required for the children. We need to ensure that we have the right carer for the right child, which I don't think happens at the moment. We do a lot of matching before we place a child for adoption, and we know from our research adoption breakdowns are really low. But as I mentioned previously, the number of foster care breakdowns are really high. And one reason is that we are not matching the placement, the child with the care that can provide the most stability in terms of the relationships across time for those children.
Okay, there's a lot to go into there, and I think Ian's going to expand on the point about the different outcomes across different forms of care. So, but I'm grateful for all of those answers, which provoke a lot of questions, I think.
You read my mind, Robin. That this is a very general question, and I know that each individual child is an individual and therefore has a different range of quite often very complex needs. But in general terms, how do outcomes differ across the various forms of care, such as adoption, fostering, residential and kinship care?
I think you can't compare adoption with the others, simply because the children here who are being adopted are very young. Rarely does a child under 3 be placed in permanent foster care. So we're not comparing like with like. If we're talking about breakdowns, very few adoption placements break down. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody lives happily ever after. We do know a great deal. I'm not quite sure. I think there are probably there's a higher proportion of adopted children in residential care or mental health facilities than is the number of in other groups. So we've got to. It's no magic cure, but certainly adoptive families stick by their children, no doubt about that. They hang on in there. They grandparent the children of their adopted children. Foster care, again, if the child in the middle years, let's say age 4 to 10, is placed and remains in a stable foster family, they do well, undoubtedly. I think we need to differentiate between foster carers. There are some foster carers who are task-centred, if you like. They're brilliant at getting children back home or for adoption. We do need to recruit what I call family for life foster carers. And we've not done enough of that, actually. And it links with Dinithi's point about matching. And I would just say we do not need regional care, whatever the care, regional, what they call cooperatives for foster care. They need to remain local, and the decision about which child goes where must lie with the child's social worker who knows them, who knows their family. And this turnover of social workers is one of the really major issues.
But in terms of matching a child with an appropriate placement for their needs, it depends what's available at the time when the child needs to be placed. That's the problem, isn't it?
Well, there are a serious problem we have is about contracting out to the large agencies, because a child's foster home, if it's in the private sector placement agency, residential foster care, if the placement breaks down, the local authority tends to go along with, all right, we'll find us another one. Rather than going back to that child's community and social worker and saying, okay, that placement broke down, but maybe time is now to try a return home or to try a children's home. It's almost, once the child is in a private sector placement, it sort of rolls along like this, and it ain't good.
Because we've talked earlier on about preventative strategies, but the fact that local authorities by and large are dealing with sort of crisis management on a day-to-day basis, and in that scenario, how do councils make sure an individual child or young person ends up in the social care placement most appropriate to their needs?
I have to hang on to the social workers. If the social worker does not know the child, if the child does not trust their social worker, then you're on a loser, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. What are the biggest risks and challenges for each type of care, and how should they be addressed?
That's Mike. Can we just take the outcome at 25 and not at 18? Particularly on education, the notion of assessing a child's success at 16 on GCE is so many care leavers go on to and really succeed in their late 20s. So we need to measure outcomes later.
I mean, given the last few years' experience, we've going to understand much better what happens with young people whose education becomes disrupted. And by the very nature of their condition, young people who go into the care system have had disrupted education far too much. And so therefore, is it not natural that if we can get them back into education, that they'll get positive education outcomes as they progress into adulthood?
And the Europeans keep their children in care up to age 23, 25. The Americans also, you can stay in care until you're 23. We've got to look at that again too.
There's no perfect cut-off point from my perspective.
Wherever you have the cut-off point, it's always going to be a challenge. But I think as we've seen in the fostering space, with time to stay and so on and so forth, actually extending the period helps. And also, it's notable that children with EHCPs get support up until the age of 25 now. So there is a question there linked to, I guess, the question around protected characteristics, whether there's something to be done in that respect.
In terms of risks and challenges, I think we have to identify that all children who have social care experience come with the risk of adversity. We know 66% who come into care because of abuse and neglect. Mm-hmm. They also have pre-care experiences of substance misuse by parents, parental mental ill health, domestic violence, and also in utero substance exposure, for example. So they all come with those risks into the system. And sometimes we talk about complex children and specialist foster carers, and I would like to argue that every foster carer needs to be a specialist foster carer. And I think government strategy says love is really important, but these children need love plus in the sense that they need therapeutic parenting across their life course. And also we tend to intervene when there's a crisis point, especially in terms of mental health. We know 50% of children in care have high mental health need. But that is the ones that we know of and the ones that who show symptoms of. But what we don't do at the moment is address this from the very point where the children come into care through therapeutic parenting and other forms of support. For example, 56% of children in care have special educational needs, which is again closely linked to mental health outcomes, which are again linked to long-term outcomes of productivity, mortality, etc. So it's really important that we understand those risks and challenges that these children bring into the system whilst creating a stable system for them.
We've kind of drifted into this to a certain extent, but I'm wondering, are there any particular ways to protect a child's sense of identity and their subsequent mental health when procuring long-term placements such as foster care and adoption?
Well, if we go back to the idea that what we want to do is to give children stability in their life and people who actually care about them and where they feel safe and secure. We don't do that by bussing them around the country to care homes which are a long way away, where their social workers are churning over and changing, where 20% of social workers now in children's services in England are employed through private employment agencies, are here today and gone tomorrow, and where foster care, 50% of children in foster placements in England are now placed through private for-profit fostering agencies, again, largely away from their local areas. So what we want to build are local community services for children and families, including care services for those children who at that point in time can't live with their family. We know that children in care, young people in care, as they get older, will gravitate back towards their communities. That's where they will end up. Yeah. So if that's where they're going to be, let's actually make it better for them there now. And that's not what we are doing. We are sending children a long way away, breaking their school links, their friendship links, their family links. They're unseen by their social workers, and the social worker today might not be the social worker tomorrow. So we know how to do this. And if you want to have some ideas about what we do in terms of investment, I'm happy to share those with you as well, because we can actually make a difference. And at the moment, what we are doing is we are making it worse for children.
Can I ask, are there any areas within England or within the UK where they are succeeding in not sending those children much further away, and what can we learn from those in terms of addressing need locally?
Yeah, it amazes me how well some areas are doing. It really does amaze me how well some local authorities are doing, how well some directors of children's services and their staff are doing with their colleagues in health and in schools, etc. It amazes me, because I would struggle to be doing it as well as they are now doing it in the circumstances in which they're working.
Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, okay. Go to Essex, go to Hampshire, go to places where they've retained their children's homes, where they still have local provision, where they have stability of leadership, where the councils actually are, in terms of governance, focus on what is the experience of children and families within their communities rather than doing exciting things in terms of innovation. They've calmed it down They've got stability, they have leaders who've been around for a long time, they've got a culture where their workforce feels safe and supported and where their services are embedded within their communities. And they know those communities in terms of what's going on for children and families within those communities. And they know the professionals in other agencies. They know the health officers, they know the GPs. To the extent we have community policing, they know the community policing officers. They know the head teachers in the schools, despite the fragmentation in education these days. That's where it's working well. And if you go to places like Hampshire, Hertfordshire, Leeds, Essex, you'll find it. But it's really difficult to do in the context in which we have the churn and change today.
Just if I could say on identity, and say something about kinship care, which I know you're interested in.
That. Who's going to come to next? Yes.
Right now. Right, but if I just say that contact, very many kinship care families are separated families, and there are real issues about family contact, and that's an area that really needs to be properly funded when two sides of the family are frankly scrapping at each other, basically. Maybe come back to that.
I'm going to come on to kinship care, but first, as an Essex MP, thank you for what you just said, and I think that Essex is also the largest provider of children's social services in the country.
You have a fantastic Director of Children's Services.
Thank you. Helen. Kinship care. June, I heard what you just said, but before we get there, on the question about outcomes that Ian just asked, how do kinship care children compare to foster children, compare to others when it comes to their long-term outcome?
They generally do better across the world, basically. But they do need more help. They need episodic help. They need, as do adoptive families.
I'm going to come to that question. I just wanted the outcomes. So I think kinship carers, so many that I've met, have done an amazing job, but often struggled financially. So I was really pleased when the government raised the kinship care allowance from £154 to £270 a week. Is that sufficient financially, or does the government need to take more financial steps to support kinship carers?
Can I answer that? Yeah. I think one thing that needs to be noted here is the kinship care allowance is at the moment only in eight local authorities, all local authorities, and it's been tested at the moment, and it's not a national part of the national strategy at the moment. And we know from our data that kinship children do better than children in foster care in almost all outcomes. And also answering the previous identity question, we know for mental health also it's better for children to be placed in kinship care. They have better mental health outcomes. But to answer your question about allowances, we do know, as you mentioned, they live in the most poverty-stricken areas, they live in more deprived areas, 50% are grandparents, they might have long-term conditions and health conditions, and they are also likely to be living in households where there's a disability in place. And one thing that needs to be addressed is, although government's kinship strategy, which was published in December, is quite welcome, because it has been in the coming for a long time, it still only recognises those kinship carers with a special guardianship order, a legal order. But there are many kinship carers in the wider society, in the community, who are informally looking after children, who come from similar backgrounds as those in social care, who are doing a service, and they are not part of this offering at the moment, and this should seriously be considered.
That's helpful. So the legal importance. Sorry, June.
Just to come back on the other extreme, there are some children in kinship care who need to remain in care. There are all sorts of reasons. Those with very seriously mentally ill parents who nevertheless still love them. Those kinship carers do need the extra support sometimes of the being in care service. And I think sometimes we rush too much to say, get them out of care. I think the other group are the seriously disabled children. We must look at them. Shared care, shared kinship care with respite foster carers. I know there's a law commission's looking at disabled children at the moment, and thinking in terms of shared kinship care, shared parental care, keeping your, back to identity, keeping your relationships by people working together, really.
That got to me to my next question, was what other measures can we take to improve kinship care? So you've spoken about episodic issues, you've spoken about the importance of maintaining relationships with other parts of the family that might be fractured, you've spoken about that shared care for a disabled child, and often the need kinship care themselves have got disabilities to make sure they're getting support for their disabilities. So I guess you're saying there isn't a one-size-fits-all need there that would be for every kinship carer, but there may be subsections within kinship carers who have got additional needs and need additional support. Is there anything else you'd like to?
Including the kinship carers who need support from the adult social care services. Some of them have disabilities, many of them are older, and we need working across from adult social care. I personally would like to see adult social care more closely linked with children's social care in the local authorities. Children have parents, many of whom have needs of their own.
So I was recently at one of my local Timpsons, and I was stopped by the person who was working there, who is themselves a special guardian and kinship carer for 3 young children. And he said that this had been the most amazing employer to recognise what he did as kinship care and give that flexibility. Do we need more awareness with employers to have that flexibility for kinship carers, and more general awareness?
Very much so, yes.
Can I just ask, because you mentioned the statistic of 50% of kinship carers being grandparents, and it always strikes me, as I've had a lot of kinship care cases in my surgeries over the years, one of the difficulties is the working of the pensions system and related benefits, that it's not really set up to recognise caring responsibilities for grandparents in that sense. And so you have a pension which is designed to be able to sustain someone in their old age, but that person having to live off it and support young children from it in a way that the system is not really designed to meet. Are there any simple changes that could be made that you think would make a difference to that?
Not my expertise.
Well, I think it's a really good general point there, which is that we tend to see this as a kind of social care issue over here, and we expect children's services within social care to find the money to cover the cost of grandparents or whoever, brothers and sisters sometimes, who are caring for children. If we made this a part of the social security agenda, as a kind of rights entitlement through social security, rather than as a social care rationed entitlement over there, we could actually simplify it, we could make it more equitable, and the people would get the help they would need without it being stigmatising.
And I've often had kinship carers explain to me, their child, it might be niece, nephew, grandchild, often comes to them in a rush because of a crisis or a death. And often they've had to stop working to stabilise the situation. Should we be pressing for something like the right to have maternity leave, paternity leave for at that period of time, a short break from work to stabilise the child?
I think also recognizing that 25% are siblings who sometimes leave employment and activity to look after their siblings. So something like that would be really useful.
I mean, to say,
to enable them.
As with paternity leave, you can take a period of leave, kinship leave at that time. Thank you. Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you. Flick.
Yep, so I'm a Hampshire MP, so I'm very thrilled too.
Two MPs, very happy.
You have a very good Director of Children's Services as well.
Yeah, no, very, very good indeed. Actually, one's just left, but we've got a good one as well, so that's great. So this actually is directed to you, Ray, because in your submission, and we've heard from the previous panel about private provision and the profits that are made. And I think you actually said it's the colonisation of the care of the children, often by distant international venture capitalists. So I just want to look into that more, about what evidence is that private provision leads to poorer services. Are they, it's not Ofsted, does it? Yeah, Ofsted say that 80% of them outstanding or good? And what about the outcomes for children? So if you could just explore that for me.
Well, one of the big concerns about the model, the commercial model, is the leverage which has been drawn on by the commercial companies, international commercial companies who've come in, venture capitalist companies who come into this marketplace. It is very fragile. It's very vulnerable. And there's no commitment in terms of the care. The commitment is in terms of the business model and making the profit. So we are in a position where this could collapse at any time. It really could. And we've seen big providers collapse. When I was the Director of Children's Services, I think it was called Sedgefield Care, Sedgefield, ran children's homes in Somerset in the southwest. And overnight, literally overnight, they closed their children's homes. And we had something like 30 or 40 children across 3 or 4 local authorities that we had to find placements for. Absolutely awful for the children, and we were in a bit of a crisis ourselves. So we have a model which actually is creating tremendous vulnerability, both in terms of the children but the system overall. That's the first comment I would make. The second bit is, and this came up in the conversation earlier with the panel before, this is not about meeting the needs of children. The children's homes that are being opened by these commercial companies are in areas of low-cost housing. There are often decaying seaside towns, for example, where there's instability in terms of their communities. Those communities themselves provide, if you like, threat and fear and exploitation opportunities for the young people being placed there miles away from their social workers and their families. So we have a model which is not only, if you like, based on making a profit, it's a model on trying to keep the cost down. And that's the third comment I'd make, coming back to the quality of the service. And if you go back to the Martin Nery's review of children's residential care of 2015-16, I think, and he did a foster care review around the same time. And what you will find is that overall, some of the providers are doing a really good service, but at a high cost. And we heard about the high cost just now, but at a really high cost. But some of them are keeping down their cost in terms of their margins by employing less qualified workers on pretty poor contracts, so you get a turnover in the workforce. And in terms of the manager and supervisory oversight, they have much poorer ratios in terms of management and supervisory roles within those care homes, because that's a cost. So the model at the moment is a very vulnerable and fragile model, and it's a model that, going back to the conversation that we had just now, the comments I was making just now, is not based on caring for children locally within their communities. It's finding a placement wherever you can at a point of crisis. And why have we got here? Why have we got here? Because a message has been given to local authorities over the last 15, 20 years even, of becoming enabling authorities, strategic planners rather than direct providers of services. Some authorities may have bucked the trend. But the consequence of that was, from about 2010 onwards, local authorities were closing their children's homes. Because the model was, you commission, you purchase, you don't provide. And that's led us now to the position where we have to reinvest, capital investment, we have to reinvest in local provision, because the model that's been created is not a stable and secure model.
How much does it cost local authorities then to set up now? I suppose it depends on the price of property, doesn't it? But
well, the best way to do this actually is not to buy properties.
Right, okay.
The best way is when you've got a housing development locally, with that housing developer, as a part of the planning permission, get them to put in the requirement for providing a children's home, for example.
Okay.
I can remember doing that as a Director of Social Services. And it's got two benefits. A, it tends to be purpose-built, and it's within a new community, it's growing, so you don't have that community angst about a children's home within their community. But the other bit about it is you keep the cost down as well in terms of that capital investment. So there's ways of doing this. But it actually does require, in my view, a capital fund which is in excess of what's being allocated at the moment to allow local authorities to rebuild what they have lost over the last 15 years.
Can I just say something about workforce again? We have a good system for training social workers, but we need to review how we're making best use of it. I personally am not too keen on specialist child and family workers. I think we get more out of our social workers if they're trained across the board so that they can move between the different areas of practice. We've got good systems for training foster care workers. We should be ashamed of what we've done about the training of residential childcare workers. We have no training for we don't go out into the schools and say being a residential childcare worker is a career that you should really be thinking of, as the Europeans do, basically. And if we trained our residential care workforce properly and worked with our local authorities, why don't we have an apprenticeship system for residential childcare workers, for instance?
And do you think that's partly related to the fact that the local authorities aren't doing that work? They are commissioning it rather than doing it, and therefore they're not engaged in that training discussion.
Yeah, the local authorities and the voluntary sector. Barnardo, the voluntary sector for years provided very good quality children's homes, but I'm not sure how North Yorkshire, I think, is somewhere that has a no wrong door system. There are local authorities who could really pilot apprenticeships into residential childcare. Teenagers often want to work with children. We're losing those people.
Are the private sector providers of homes engaged in any major training?
Not at all. People move from all over the place into residential care, unqualified, we need the knowledge, the values and the skills. They move in and they train on the job. Now, an apprenticeship would be on the job, but alongside the knowledge, the values.
You know if there's an apprenticeship standard for residential care?
No, I don't think there are. I'm just raising it because it would be one thing we could really look at.
Something that we could.
Who provides it?
We could look at and recommend, because I think it's the kind of thing that we're worthwhile. But you need to create the demand for it, and in order to do that, you need to have either the private providers or the voluntary sector or the local authorities being willing to engage on that and invest for sufficient time and resource. But it certainly seems like something which would be along the lines of what this committee could
certainly be happy. I know that the sector well enough to think about that.
I mean, are there homes that we should go and visit, or you would recommend as a good model?
I was a trustee of the Break charity, which provided very good longer-term therapeutic parenting for children, and of course staying close. The very important thing about staying close is you stay close to your children's home, not that you stay close to some housing association. Long-term relationships to the siblings you had in your children's home, for instance.
There were some really good examples of staying close.
Thank you. Yeah, Andrew.
Thank you. So slight change of focus and specifically for Dinithi here. Well, what's your assessment of the current standard of mental health amongst children in care and care leavers, and how could we improve those standards?
In terms of long-term outcomes, we know mental health is linked to long-term outcomes of children in care. And the statistics are really stark. I think these were discussed previously. 52% of those in the criminal justice system are care experienced. 25% of those who are homeless are care experienced. And in terms of long-term outcomes, we know that they are economically disadvantaged, less productive, and in terms of physical health, they are impacted and also have early mortality. And one thing that precedes most of these outcomes is mental health that is not good enough for children in care. And our research confirms what we've known from previous research, that around 50% of children in care have a very high mental health need, which needs intervention. And one would then say we then need to monitor these children well and then provide support for these children. In terms of monitoring the children's mental health, it is a statutory requirement on the local authorities that they return data on the assessments of children's mental health every year to the Department for Education. And most local authorities do it for most children. However, our research shows that this data is then not used by the local authorities or all local authorities to provide the support the children need. Some local authorities do. They refer children on or provide in-house support. So kind of the postcode lottery that we talked of, because they have different systems in place in different local authorities. But some wait until the next review, which might be 6 months on. Some don't do anything at all. So there is a problem in the system. We are collecting data on the mental health, but there's no statutory requirement placed on the local authorities to provide support based on these assessments that they make.
So in terms of that patchwork that you're referring to, what sort of proportion of local authorities are gathering the information but not doing anything with it?
We spoke to 12 local authorities, so I would not talk of proportions, but some do and some don't, and it is patchy. And we hear from other local authorities as well that it is not consistent in terms of support.
Can I just make a comment on this? Because it does go back to some of the things I've been saying. We don't want to overcomplicate this. When we're talking about mental health needs and for children in care, foster care, residential care, adolescents particularly, we're not talking about children with psychosis, not talking with children with major mental illness. We're talking with children with emotional upset, children who have anxiety levels, depression, withdrawing, maybe showing aggression. Are we surprised? Are we surprised? Have we given them the experiences we've had, which sometimes are quite traumatic and moving around? Even coming into care when the care is good is a traumatic experience. Yeah? You're coming into an unknown area as a 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 8-year-old, whatever. And one of my concerns is that we almost medicalise this. You see CAMS as the magic bullet, and we have waiting lists for CAMS, and you get assessed, and you might get some medication, you might get a short-term cognitive behavioural therapy program or whatever. But if we get back to just thinking what those life experiences for those children are, if we can give them the continuity, the care, the assurance that they know what's going to be happening for them in the future, relationships which are continuing with their siblings, with their families, with their friends in their local communities, that's a much better solution than more and more CAMS referrals.
So the government's response to that, they would suggest, I think, is their stable homes and built on love strategy. So what's your assessment of the role of mental health within that strategy? Or June, because you haven't talked about this yet, because I haven't asked you, but other reflections on this mental health topic. Yeah.
It's about the universal and the specialist and the targeted. We do need a high quality. Children have a right to a health service as a universal service, as indeed they have a right to a high quality education service. That needs to be built up for every child, and it should be available to your child in your children's home or your foster home. But then some of them do need this extra special therapeutic care, perhaps for a short period of time. Yeah. And then it needs to be available when it needs to be available, not in 6 months or indeed 2 years' time.
Makes sense.
I think the strategy mentions mental health 14 times. I did a search, but there is no specificities on how it will actually be implemented. There is no extra allocation of budgets for it. However, in terms of retaining more staff, for example, social workers, it's really important, because what our research shows is relationships across the children's spheres of developmental context are really important. So children's relationship with their carers, their social workers, their peers, their schools, they're all really important in predicting better mental health. And I think going back to the questions about identity, placing with siblings is also quite protective. Placement with kinship care is protective. And our survey showed that 9 out of 10 children in our survey had a sibling, but only 4 out of 10 were placed with one. So there's a disconnect in the numbers of who's placed with the siblings. And I think I would like to draw the attention of this committee to this committee's report in 2006, which looked at the mental health of looked after children, which made recommendations which are still not in place. So I would really like...
One of the few historic reports of this committee that Ian wasn't involved in drafting. So.
I think those recommendations...
It even predates me, and that's a long time ago.
So no, we will make sure we dig that out and go through those recommendations, because I think it is important that when committees make recommendations, they get followed up.
I think one thing that we can do within the system without changing much is actually do the assessments well, and also include children's views in it. And I think this committee recommended that this should be part of the 6 monthly reviews that children have. It can easily be done because it's part of the statutory system. But apart from doing a screening test for mental health, it should be a developmental contextual test or a screening of all things that are important for children and their mental health, done by the social worker.
But if the strategy sort of outlines some aspirations, but doesn't actually tell you the how and what with.
Absolutely.
Is it a strategy at all, or is it just a sort of list of aspirations?
I think it mentions the NHS's long-term plans, the universal provision for children, which some children do need, but in terms of universal provision, we don't have it right either. I think recent research showed that 44% of children are waiting more than a month in terms of universal provision to get mental health support, and 26% of those had thought of taking their own lives while they were waiting, and 1 in 10 still get turned away even when they reach that door. So there are problems, and we'd say that children in care have more complex needs if they do need that sort of support.
But I think also you've looked as a committee at the schools, the availability of the drop-in to the counsellor at a school, which is available to any else of your fellow pupils, basically. So it's a crossover, isn't it, basically, between school, between the health service, and between the, if you like, targeted specialist needs of the child in care.
But to Professor Jones's point of recognising some of the additional pressures which these children are likely to be facing, and that therefore a degree of mental health and anxiety is natural, and the system needs to be adapted to that, rather than necessarily assuming that's something which requires a referral to CAMHS on every occasion, I think is an important one.
Yeah, and that bit about schools is really important. Yeah. It really is important.
I think
and I'm in 2 schools each week, 1 primary school and 1 secondary school. And in the secondary school, they have a hub, which is a safe space for children, students. It's a secondary school, where they just might need some time out, where they can go. And there's staff there who are there to talk with, but they can just spend some time there. And they get some care, but they have some space. In the primary school, it's somewhat different. The primary school employs a higher grade teaching assistant, and she's there, again, giving particular time for children who not every day in care. They might be bereaved, they might have a parent who's gone to prison, might have a parent with a terminal illness or whatever, might be domestic disputes back in the home. She's there for those children. She will know about 30 or so children at any one time that she's giving special time to. And the children in the school won't know who she is. Yeah. Other children who aren't using that service know that that's what she does. It's non-stigmatising, but it's there on the doorstep. You don't have to have a referral for it. It's available. And I think if we could generalise that and make that available, I think that would be a good thing to do. And as an education committee with your interest in schools, the crossover here, not just with children's social care, but with children who might be distressed at some point in time for whatever reason.
It's about normalisation and taking away the stigma. Being in care, I'm afraid, is still seen as a stigma, and anything we can do to reduce that stigma is just so important to these young people.
Just on that, I mean, this conversation about protected characteristic, is there a risk that it makes it more of a stigma rather than actually reducing it?
Have to be done so very carefully. It needs to be very carefully thought through, and I think some local authorities are thinking through it very carefully. So perhaps we can learn from them before generalising it and saying it must be done for everybody.
Going back to the point about schools, there are mental health support teams which are now available in about a third of the schools in the country, but not all students have access to it. It's a universal provision, and I think from what I understand there are no plans to extend it beyond the 24 spending period. And that sort of provision, as Ray mentioned, would be very useful for children in care as well. And I think going back to something that was discussed in the previous panel in terms of aspirations and higher education, our survey said that around a third of children were not happy going to school. So that might be linked to the instability that they've faced previously before coming to those schools. And it's really important that children's voices are heard.
Thank you, Ian.
Okay. I just wanted to... Sorry, can I? I wanted to really come back before we get to the next topic, just because of what you said about the importance of stabilising the situation. This idea for kinship carers to give them some time for parental leave, the time they take over. You've said 50% kinship carers are grandparents, but I suspect that within that 50%, a lot of them would be in their 50s, early 60s at the time they take on the child, so would be working. Is there any way we could get that sort of data
maybe you can follow up to give us that.
We have that data and we can follow it up with that.
And to understand, because that could be a very specific recommendation, to understand within kinship carers how many of them say that would have helped.
There's some really good research by Elaine Farmer, who's a colleague at Bristol University, who's done a number of studies around kinship care, which will paint exactly that picture for you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We talked earlier with the first panel about trying to do spending investment on early intervention, and I suppose that coming out of that is how can the right balance be struck between protecting children that may be at risk of harm and providing a service that aims to help parents and families first and foremost.
Well, can I have a crack at that? Because if you look at the figures, the growth in child protection activity isn't because of more concerns about children experiencing physical abuse. It's not because of an increase in numbers of children who are known to be experiencing sexual abuse. Those figures, if you look at the paper that I submitted, goes back to 2008 in terms of the timeline. Those figures have stayed remarkably stable. They've not changed. Big growth has been in children who are seriously, if you like, of concern because of neglect and because of emotional abuse. And that conversation that we had earlier, if you're really poor, if you're worn down, if it's hard getting up in the morning because you yourself are so anxious and depressed and can't face getting up and getting through the day, if you're running out of money for food during the week, if you can't clothe your children and you feel bad about it, that's how we've seen this growth in terms of neglect and emotional abuse as a concern. So my view is I wouldn't even use the phrase early help, because it suggests you get it early, but if it doesn't get better, you've gone past that and then we're into child protection, then we're into care. I'd be talking about family health, and indeed the McAllister Review talks about family health, and it's about being beside families at a point in time when they need assistance, tackling some of the issues around poverty, which is bigger than local authority areas, and making that sure that we're there when families and children are beginning to struggle. Not just you have early help, and if it doesn't work for you, it goes on to child protection. We are investigating and undertaking inquiries in relation to child protection. Just thinking of your constituencies, on average it will be 8 per week, over 30 per constituency per month in terms of new child protection investigations. 600 every day, 365 days a year in England. Most of them, not most of them, a lot of them, over 30%, and lead to no further action at all. They just close down. Big use of time, but no better benefit for the family. Indeed, the family now feel threatened and fearful because they've had a child protection investigation. So going back to the conversation we had, we want to be beside families in their communities when they're struggling and provide care for them, for their children within the communities, when at that point in time they can't care for them as well. So my pitch in terms of, and I heard it earlier, I would actually have a dedicated specific grant at the moment for local authorities in relation to family help. I wouldn't call it early intervention, I'd call it family help. I'd make it a specific grant, because if you don't make it a specific grant, it's going to get drawn into the care budget. So you actually have to protect it in some way and account for how it's being used. But I'd have that, but it has to be sizable. So much of what we do at the moment is around, sorry, I was about to say piddling, but small amounts of money, which actually spend a lot of time to bid for, and they're closed down within 2-3 years because it's short-term funding. We're not making a difference. It's very wasteful, it's inefficient. We need a sizable investment in family help within communities. We used to have it. Sure Start was a good example. We have to reinvent that.
That's, it comes back to recommendation which has been made during the course of this, but also one which we made previously as part of our childcare and early years inquiry, which is taking the family hubs rollout and making sure that's not just in 75 areas, but in every community in the country, and that could provide the route. Obviously, what you're saying is that you also need to provide the funding that makes that sustainable.
Yeah, and what I would do is I'd extend it, and Sure Start was really good, very, very successful in a whole range of indices. Very successful. But I'd extend it to 5 to 10. So I'd actually make it a bigger period, because we know there's a bit of a, in Freudian terms, a latency period between 5 to 10 in terms of services at the moment. You get services, maybe new services that are available if you're 10 years old and plus. You get early years services from 0 to 4 or 5, and there's a gap in between. So I would actually expand it up until 10, but we have a really good model. Sure Start was a really good model for doing this.
But I mean, just for clarity, Ray, you mentioned there the number of cases per constituency. Of course, that's an average, and there'll be some constituencies where those numbers are much greater and some where they're much fewer.
And the key variable which will determine that is deprivation. Poorer areas will be generating much more demand for children's social care because it's much harder to care for your children when you're suffering poverty, which is getting more intense.
I had a funny feeling you might say that, but I just wanted to get it on the record. Okay, so thank you very much. Now, Ray, how can the government reduce the stigma of intrusive and threatening child protection investigations as they are described in your written evidence?
Because most of these investigations are about concerns about neglect and emotional care of children. That's about parents who are struggling. Don't see that as a child protection concern. See that as a concern where we ought to be beside parents, helping them to care well for their children. Don't define it as child protection, define it as family help. Make it available in local communities through non-stigmatising services like family hubs, like Sure Start used to be. And this race towards child protection activity, you need to turn the tide on it.
Okay. Are there any specific steps that can be taken so that trust is regained between parents and the children's social care system?
Yeah, make it local. Have your teams of community social workers, family support workers, etc. Have your health visitors integrated with them out in your local communities, based there rather than in central offices back in town centres and city centres. Get back out into neighbourhoods with multi-professional teams who are recognised within their communities, know their communities with an open door.
Anything to add to that? No? That's lovely. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
But don't waste money on structural reform, basically. It just takes an awful lot of time, again, thinking of regional approaches. It will just take a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of money. It's worked quite well with adoption regional services, but there's something very special about them. But that took years to actually implement.
I mean, from my perspective, I couldn't agree more. I mean, some things lend themselves to more widespread geographical planning, but this is not one of them. So, yeah.
I mean, I just wonder if the balance on that, and I'm no fan of regions generally, but the balance on that is something around the need to try and pull in, particularly when you're talking about children's homes, closer to home approach when it comes to commissioning, and to be prepared to look across boundaries slightly to find the solutions to that if it avoids people being sent much further away, versus the desire to keep things as local as possible when it comes
and
to...
And local authorities can help each other. We've heard about, I come from Norfolk, I know that Norfolk and Essex work very well together. You don't need a structure to make local authorities help each other, and I'm sure you'll be hearing from the LGA.
Is that because neither of you talk about Suffolk?
well, they do fine on that.
And just in terms of
to upset my Suffolk friends.
In terms of the strategy earlier, you heard the debate from the previous panel around early intervention versus focusing on children in the system. And do you feel there is sufficient focus on early intervention in the government's response to stable homes built on love? And Ray, I think you're slightly arguing that it's the wrong type of early intervention, perhaps, is what's being focused on. But I want to put words into your mouth.
The government's response is very piecemeal. It's very patchy. It's setting up a load of new initiatives, short-term, in a small number of areas. That's going to be wasteful because people have to put in their bids. You spend time bidding for sums of money which are only going to last for 2-3 years. You start things up, you recruit staff, that takes 6 months, then you run it for about a year, 18 months, and you have to start closing it down again. Yeah. And it never gets rolled out. No one sticks with it. A new idea will come on the block. And another kid will arrive in terms of a great idea. And we'll be just churning it around. Calm it down. Get the core stuff right. Don't do the exciting stuff.
Well, over the years, Ray, I mean, how many pilots have we seen where the pilot runs, it never gets evaluated, it never gets rolled out, but and we never see what the outcome is from all of these pilots over the years.
Or it gets evaluated at vast expense, and we ignore the evaluation.
Learnings. Okay, you wanted to go on?
So, just as an Essex MP, one of the reasons that
Essex went from council which had failing children's services to outstanding, and is now, I think, the only local authority that's retained its outstanding.
Three times now.
Twice, I thought, but consistently. Was their focus on early intervention, was saying the Sure Starts is not working. Okay, the Sure Start centres were not necessarily getting to the families that needed the support, and has been the use of the Family Hub service, which I actually visited in my constituency last week, and I think it was the first Family Hub on mainland UK. There was one in the Isle of Wight beforehand. So I think there is lessons we can learn about that sort of the way that Family Hub service directs different families, including children in care, to different types of support that are there. But if we're going to say there are some local authorities that do it well, I think we also need to make sure that we understand why they do it well and not they necessarily go back to models that actually weren't working in the ones that do it well. Sorry.
You probably haven't got time for this, Chair, but sitting here just now was the Chief Executive of Barnardo's.
Yeah.
I used to work with Barnardo's. And when we were setting up family centres quite a while back now, and what we did, we would set up some family centres as community family centres, open access. What we found with those family centres is that they needed to develop targeted programmes as well within their overall provision for those families who needed sometimes challenge, but sometimes, if you like, more help. On the other hand, we set up family centres which were referral only, child protection type centres. What they found was within their communities there were other people they were identifying and needed help, so they expanded out into community provision, whilst retaining their core services as well. We need both.
But that outreach element is absolutely crucial. I think Vicky, I remember some of the concerns around Sure Starts in my patch, where even people living on the same road as the centre weren't necessarily accessing the services, and so I think it is around how do you reach the right people with the approach, and how do you make sure it is sufficiently targeted. But I think also just wanted to ask, what else should the government be doing to support struggling parents? It's a broader question. In that respect, to what extent, one of the things we've been given some written evidence on is actually trying to come up with positive parenting programmes. Frank Field, I remember, speaking very interestingly about parenting education back in the day. Do you think government should be doing more on that front? And are there ways to provide parenting support without perhaps some of the stigma that means that people tend to resent it in many cases? Because I think
it's something else we used to have.
Yeah.
It's not a magic answer, basically. As a researcher, I've come across families who said, I've done 3 parenting programmes and they were very nice. In other words, early on, as a rural, thinking about Norfolk, actually, it's quite difficult if you live in certain parts of a rural county to turn up for 10 sessions somewhere or other. So some of these programmes need to be, if you like, delivered one-to-one in the family home, particularly if geography makes, or indeed poverty, makes it impossible, or if you're a single dad, makes it impossible for you to turn up to 5 sessions. So some of them are too rigid, basically. But they must be part of what's available.
I think I can totally agree with what June said about poverty. 29% of children in England are living in poverty at the moment. And poverty can have an impact on parenting. And 71% of these children are living with families who are in working households. And we know that there are disabilities in place and there are lone parents as well. So those are all constraints that would be placed on parenting. So these are wide issues that need to be addressed in terms of addressing parenting in the houses.
3 things. Change some of the things that have been introduced in the social security system. Get rid of the 2-child benefit cap. Get rid of the capping in terms of housing benefit and where people can't afford their housing costs. Secondly, change the narrative. People who are poor, who are struggling to cope with their children and care for their children, aren't bad people. They're people who are going under. Change the narrative. And the third bit is just think of some of the universal things that we used to have available, which have been cut back, like health visiting services. We talk about specialist parenting programs, but if you're a parent who's anxious, who maybe haven't had good parenting yourself and therefore don't know how to do it well, health visitors used to be there to be beside you. We've decimated the health visiting service across the country. So in addition to the specialist provision, which we might provide through family hubs or family centres or whatever, tackle some of the poverty issues, tackle some of the narrative issues, and actually make sure the universal provision through, for example, health visiting programmes is resurrected.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that concludes our evidence session for this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.